I'm deep in the reads, and today I'll be reviewing this. It's 11/22/63 by Stephen King. Stephen King is a household name in horror fiction, but starting with the 80s he started to dabble in other genres as well, such as fantasy, magical realism, and character dramas. 11/22/63 is one such deviation from his horror writing. I would call it a romance thriller book. It stars a guy named Jake, who is kind of this schlubby, divorced high school English teacher. His friend reveals to him very early on that he happens to have a time portal leading into 1958 in his kitchen pantry. And Jake's like, okay. So Jake's friend asks that he goes to the past and prevent the JFK assassination. He believes that doing this will prevent the escalation in Vietnam and therefore save like countless thousands of lives. And if Jake messes up, he can go back through the portal to his own time and then step back into 1958, and it'll wipe the slate clean of any of the changes he made. So even if things turn out worse, he can fix it. The first 200 or so pages are pretty good. They're very briskly paced, with Jake discovering the time portal to his early experiments and experiences with the past and his effect on them. And there's a lot of thriller scenes early on too, as well as a lot of like mysteries that Stephen King weaves into the narrative. His writing style is engaging as well. Like, whereas most authors will hold the reader at arm's length with a lot of formality, Stephen King is a lot more casual as a writer, a lot more informal and friendly. So he comes across like an old bar buddy telling you stories with a lot of like blue humor and witty asides sort of in the prose. The only issue early on is that Jake is a pretty flat character, but the story is so plot driven in the early sections that you're able to ignore it, basically. It's not until Jake settles down in the small town of Jody and decides to like wait out the 5 years until the Kennedy assassination that things sort of switch gears. So, how does Stephen King fill in the gap for those 5 years? How does he kill the time? With a badly done romantic slice of life story. And don't get me wrong, that could have been great. I love slice of life stories like Cannery Row by John Steinbeck or Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, but here the character writing just cannot carry. It quickly becomes apparent that this book is a romance in thriller's clothing, and whether it works for the reader or not is based entirely on whether or not you are convinced by the romance. And it's apparent that what Stephen King was trying to do was make Jake's life in the 60s parallel his life in the past with his ex-wife. Like, the two relationships sort of parallel each other in some ways. And that would have been interesting, like this idea that Jake is living in the past, both figuratively and literally, but it's anchored to a soap opera. The relationship that develops between Jake and Sadie is sort of like this paternalistic, patronizing sort of thing, where Sadie is like the doe-eyed, vulnerable, clumsy girl, and then Jake, on the other hand, is like this self-assured father figure who always knows best. It's not that I don't like romance. Like, the novel Three Comrades by Eric Maria Remarque is a fantastic novel. And I'm fine with romance in larger stories too, like the relationship between Elena and Marco in the Saga series. As long as the character writing is good. But, oh god, let me give you an example. I will give you an example from the book of how this relationship plays out in the book. So, Sadie has just gotten through telling Jake this traumatic thing from her past. And enter scene. She's like, George, I don't think I can talk about this anymore. Not now. I feel, I don't know, like a bottle of soda that's been shaken up. Do you know what I want? I want you to take me inside and then take the cap off. She hadn't bothered putting her bra back on, and I could see her breasts lift under her blouse. Her nipples made tiny shadows like punctuation marks against the cloth in the late night. She said, I don't want to relive the past today. Today, I just want to fizz. And don't get me started on the sex scenes. As you spend time with Jake, it becomes apparent that he is an incredibly dull character. Like, in the course of his mission, he's presented with all of these like moral quandaries, but he barely bats an eye at any of it. He's not exactly a curious or introspective character for someone who is literally altering reality with time travel. And example, what does he do during his 5 years in the past? Exactly what he was doing before. He settles down in a small town and he teaches English at a high school. Although this high school may or may not be racially segregated, which we will get back to that. This book has like 400 pages of agonizing wheel spinning. Jake's gonna get back to the time travel plot eventually. But wait, first he has to tell you about 16 plays, 20 dances, a potluck, a benefit gig, and 15 concerts. I don't know. Every once in a while, Jake will drive out to Dallas, where he's keeping tabs on Lee Harvey Oswald, kind of like a private investigator. And then it's right back to Jody for more of the same. Rinse repeat between Jody and Dallas, all the way up until the end, with a few suspense and drama scenes added as well. It's all mind-numbingly repetitive and predictable, to the point where Stephen King actually has multiple plot devices to justify how repetitive the writing is. Like, he reminds the reader over and over, the past harmonizes, ooh! And so if you feel like you're reading the same scenes over and over again, it's not bad writing, it's the harmonizing past, you see. And that's not even the only term he uses to justify the repetition. The other term is that the past is obdurate, which is like, the past is like this malevolent force, and if you try to change it too much, like it'll put a barricade in your way, it'll find some obstacle to throw at you. But every obstacle that's thrown in Jake's way is completely negated a second later by something completely, like, so convenient. So this harmonizing past and this obdurate past thing is like this just cheat that Stephen King has, where he can easily put his character in danger and then pull him right back out again without even really thinking about it. The past is obdurate, but apparently it's also impotent. And there's zero subtlety about it either. Every time the harmonizing past or the obdurate past does something, Stephen King just smashes you over the head with it. He puts it in writing to make it absolutely clear so that you don't misunderstand. And speaking of spoon feeding, all of the enigmas and mysteries that Stephen King sets up early on are completely robbed of all of their gravity by not one, but two info dumps at the end of the book. That's the core issue with the book. Every time Stephen King stumbles his way into an interesting idea, he invariably takes the least interesting approach with it and takes it in the most uninteresting place. It's really a shame because I really wanted to like this book. But anyway, we gotta talk about the last thing. The past is completely sanitized in this. One or two nods to the racism of the time is consistently undercut by a saccharine stream of heavy romanticizing, which to me was a really big barrier in feeling immersed in the time period that he's trying to present. Like, he waxes idyllic about how people used to be more neighborly, more polite, and closer together. As long as you steered clear of that racist old curmudgeons, you'd be fine. He reminds the reader, hey, don't forget, I saw a segregated latrine one time. But that's really about it. I mean, Jake is teaching in Texas, right? And Texas began to integrate its schools in the mid-50s, but it wasn't until the mid to late 60s that it had completed doing this, because it kept dragging its feet. So Jake, for all we know, could be teaching at a segregated school. Either that, or he's at a recently integrated school. But either way, Stephen King does nothing with that. He just leaves it on the cutting room floor. And it's really unfortunate too, because this book, the past period that's covered, takes place during the peak of the civil rights movement. The topic of racial integration was so ubiquitous and heated at the time that people were worrying about the social fabric of the nation being torn apart. And you get almost no sense of that. The one time that Jake encounters something that points out the institutionalized racism of the country, it's a flyer from Lee Harvey Oswald, and Jake's reaction is to criticize it for spelling mistakes and tuck it away for later. Stephen King fails at depicting the social dynamics of one of the most interesting and turbulent times in 20th century America. The setting feels staged, plastic, and hollow. It's like a Disneyland attraction. And at some points you get the impression that Stephen King forgets that he's supposed to be writing in the 60s. Like, at one point, Jake goes out and buys condoms that are ribbed for her pleasure. Did those condoms exist in the 60s? I don't fucking think so. To wrap up, in 11/22/63, Stephen King takes what could have been an interesting time travel plot and turns it into a badly executed romance that is riddled with contrivance, corniness, and cliche. And there are some good moments here. It's just that they're buried under a whole lot of slogging. King could have done so much with this novel, but he just blew it on every front for me. And I really can't fathom why it's considered one of his best works. Aside from a few well-executed suspense scenes, I think it's one of his weakest. I've read 32 Stephen King books at this point, and while it's not quite in the bottom 5, it's not that far off either for me. I give this book the low rating of 3 stars out of 10. Well, there you have it, folks. My first BookTube review shouted into the void. It certainly reminded me why I stopped reading Stephen King, although somewhere down the road I would like to review one of his books that I actually enjoyed. I don't plan on doing regular uploads, but if you're interested in seeing more of my thoughts on books, consider subscribing. And I promise my next review will be a lot more positive than this one was. Yeah. How do I end videos again?